I'm Relando Thompkins-Jones. A lot of my work revolves around using education as a bridge, a tool, not only to highlight what some of the social issues are that create tension and conflict and power and privilege in society, but also to use education as a way to assist folks and also learn myself about how we can participate in being a part of the solution, how we can participate in being a part of the remedying social problems. So even as I stand here and as we sit here in this room, I just want to acknowledge that we're not just sitting in this room together. We're sitting in this room in a society that has a larger social, political context. Each of us carries with us different identities, different experiences that contribute to how we came to be and the decisions that we make. So another important underlying theme in my work is if we can not only think about how we think, but if we can change the way we think, we can change what we do. So this morning I'm going to be talking with you all about the idea of getting out of our own way, how self-reflection can be powerful for us when we're contributing to working towards social change. So as I begin, I'm going to share a few things about me, and I'm hoping that you think about your own experiences too. I have a writing space that I call Notes from an Aspiring Humanitarian, where I share different inspirations, different quotes, different resources related to social justice. And so for my talk here this morning, I'm going to be sharing a few things that I've put together over the course of the last few years. But this first piece starts about me. It's a quote that says, "Because oppression is seen as systemic, we tend to absolve ourselves of blame. But unless someone chooses to identify with systems and institutions, the act of honest confession will never take place." It can be really easy in this work to point fingers at other folks as if as if we're blameless. But what's harder, and actually possibly even more necessary, is to look at ourselves and find ways that we contribute to the chaos so we can make changes. My experiences have shown me that in the process of working towards social justice outwardly, it's also important for us to critically examine ourselves, shedding attitudes and behaviors that are oppressive to make room for those that are more inclusive and humanitarian. So these following thoughts are just some reflections on identity and how that can play a role. So I'll begin with some thoughts on my African American identity because I believe that my experiences with racism, including how I perceive things, as well as how I think people are perceiving me based on my status as an African American male, have not only been the catalyst to my own learning about my own oppression, but has also given me a sensitivity to be able to see inequality in groups other than my own. So, as an African American male, I'm reminded of my skin color on a daily basis, and not just my skin color, but the lack of value that is placed on my life because of that. News reports, television shows, movies, and other forms of media perpetuate the image of African American men as being crime-prone, irresponsible, untrustworthy, overall threatening. From a young age, a great deal of my socialization within my racial identity has revolved around making sure that I appear non-threatening to white people. The message that was conveyed through this socialization in ways that are subtle and also overt tended to say and suggest that you're a black male and you're seen as a threat. The rules are different for you. Folks are watching you. Folks are afraid of you. If you find yourself somehow in a court of law and you expect to be treated like everybody else, you're kidding yourself. These are some of the messages. I still act today with those messages in mind. Many of the decisions that I've made, including staying away from drugs or alcohol, stem from an attempt to stay out of the crosshairs. But however, I still remain conscious of the reality that No amount of education, status, or money can shield me from the effects of racism, including racial profiling. Although the word privilege does not readily come to my mind when considering my identity as an African American male, I know that I receive unearned benefits from a society that promotes men and subjugates women. At times, I've automatically been placed in positions of leader or authority figure on some occasions in work or group settings where I've been the only male, regardless of experience. No one has ever told me that I will have to make a choice between having a career and having a family. My work takes me in a lot of different places, but because of the privilege that comes with my male identity and the expectations that are placed on that identity, I can pretty much safely assume that I will never be accused of being an unsupportive partner for pursuing my career interests in ways that that women are constantly criticized, are constantly kind of guilt-tripped into, do you really want to do that? I can assume because of the privilege that comes with my male identity that won't get that. I don't have to worry about being harassed in the street because of my gender identity in the ways that others do. I will say, though, that as an African American male, I'm more concerned with being in the wrong place at the wrong time or falsely accused by law enforcement or someone else for a crime that I didn't commit. So I'm more worried actually about being mistaken for someone, because I am often mistaken for other Black folks who look similar to me in a way that communicates a message that all Black people look alike, and that's not the case. But so sometimes this happens in very friendly, well-intended, right, situations. But imagine how that looks then if it's law enforcement. Or if it's something, someone, it looked like that guy, and lives can be lost, things can be changed because of that. So I'm actually more afraid of that than some sort of physical assault. In the doctrine of Christianity on which I was raised, men were promoted as the leaders and decision makers, while women were expected to be submissive and go with the flow. They were forbidden from preaching, and biblical scripture was used to justify their banning. They were permitted to speak, however, but not in the pulpit. They had to stand on the main floor just below the pulpit where only men can stand. While they could serve as ushers, charity workers, or cooks in the kitchen, they did not have hands in many of the decision-making processes of the church. Although I do not currently identify with a specific religious practice, my Christian upbringing allows me the privilege to be able to blend in, if I so choose, and protect myself from loss of respect, credibility, and rejection in close relationships and other social situations, from differential treatment in working settings, and a range of other areas. My familiarity with the faith allows me the opportunity to blend in where others who are either unfamiliar or visibly different in some ways due to different practices cannot. But I can freely enjoy the Christmas season and the time I spend with my family and other loved ones. I can celebrate Christmas without someone thinking that what I'm doing is wrong, and I will not be viewed as a threat to national security if I decide to decorate a tree this year. While my Christian upbringing has indeed allowed me to make connections with a variety of people, the benefits that I've received in the past and could still stand to gain by promoting this view as the only view at the expense of other faiths far outweighs the consequences of asserting my belief that peace can be found in a variety of perspectives and belief systems. Currently, I consider myself to be young and otherwise healthy. Although it's true that anything can happen to me at any moment, I do not always think of my health or ability on a daily basis, and that's something that we're talking about, self-reflection and social change. So I'm hoping as I'm sharing some of these things, you all can also think about some of the things that you either have to think about on a daily basis, but even more importantly, in some ways, the things that you don't, so you can begin to sort of increase your awareness of those things. I don't always think about my health or ability on a daily basis. I can read without assistance, and I don't need to worry about whether or not closed captioning is available. Even in my coming into this building this morning, not having a whole lot of concerns about accessibility. But in terms of examining critically examining ourselves, think about, the fact that I don't have to think about that and the things that you might not have to think about on a daily basis. How does that actually limit our perspective and what's happening? How does that limit our ability to empathize with people? How does that limit our ability to act in ways that are more humane to folks? I don't have a condition that would cause people to gawk or stare in the way, or an identity to stare in the way that I have seen happen to some folks with disabilities. However, as a person of color, I've experienced stares and looks when I walked into restaurants, stores, or other public places, as if my audience has never seen a person of color in real life before, or aren't used to seeing people of color in this part of town. I can move through public spaces with my partner without receiving hateful comments about our relationship or sexuality. I can hold her hand or show other public displays of affection without someone telling us that our union is unnatural. Any talks or plans about settling down were met with interest and good wishes, even excitement. So I don't have to validate my sexuality or my relationship with my partner to other people. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. I know what it's like to see signs on my way into a store that read, "Accept no checks from the 313 area code." So that's the area code in Detroit for folks who aren't familiar. Because apparently all Detroiters write bad checks is the messaging of that, right? I've had the experience of having my own home broken into and experienced feelings of helplessness after calling the police, only to wait for hours for them to arrive at the scene. Sometimes no one would come at all. In other instances, I had the experience of, after requesting help, being treated as the suspect and the criminal, which has impacted my relationships in terms of trust and things like that with law enforcement. Still, I cannot deny the fact that my college education allows me opportunities for change in status and upward mobility that is not given as easily to those who do not have degrees. In many cases, people without college education are automatically locked out altogether. So revisiting this idea that because oppression is seen as systemic, we tend to absolve ourselves of blame. It's the system. The system is so large, but you know what the system is made up of? People who make decisions based on what they think that can impact lives. So we can say we're committed to social justice. We can say we value folks, all day. But if we're not really thinking about how we might be participating in some of the discrimination and the marginalization and the pain that's happening, that's giving us a level of blamelessness that just doesn't exist. We're all implicated in this somehow. And so it's important for us to reflect on that. But one of the big barriers to doing that is fear. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on fear for a moment. So overcoming fear of others, recognizing that we aren't developed in some way, is a huge roadblock and continues to be a recurring challenge in social justice work. And, individuals and institutions can go a long way to trying to cover up the fact that there's something they need to learn, there's something they're not doing, or there's something that they are doing that's contributing to marginalization. But letting go and owning that can be liberating. So just a really quick example. So to celebrate the realization that I was taking this new position, I wanted to do something that I'd never done before. And so about a year ago, coming up this summer, I actually learned how to ride a bike. My wife taught me. So initially I struggled with taking it on because I developed some shame around not knowing how to do it over the years, and sometimes I would either share it with folks or I would just in passing conversations here like, oh, you should know this already. You're this old and you don't know. There are like lots of reasons that contributed to why that didn't happen. But develop some shame around it because there's this expectation that it was something that I should already know or that I should have already done. But more than being ashamed, I was afraid. So I was afraid of falling. I was afraid of how others would perceive me. I was also afraid that too much time had passed for me to get it right and that I wouldn't be able to learn. But one of the things that was true about that process for me was that once I accepted that I would fall, once I accepted that, some people might think that I look silly, that I was too old to try. Once I accepted that, but still understood that learning the skill was worth that risk, my outlook changed. So I did fall a lot, but I learned too. It got easier after a while, and now I write all the time. But what I didn't know at the time, but understand now more than ever, is how relevant that exercise was for me, not just to the new role that I was taking, but also to social justice work. So fear is a very, very formidable opponent. So in my work as a social justice educator, working with community members, students, some faculty, very credentialed folks, and other professionals for whom the very nature of the environments that they are in demand that they be competent and speak from a place of confidence and security in their areas of study, work, or expertise. In a way, many of these environments, as they are traditionally constructed, are inherently designed to foster a climate of posturing and superficiality, where folks can put on a mask and pretend that they know information about individuals or groups of people under some guise of cultural competence that they don't actually have. Now, there's another element to that, too, that we'll talk about called social justice elitism, which was in some of the readings that were read earlier, or the use of language as a tool to shame and exclude other people who don't know as much. And that's another form of posturing, too. When I think of social justice education, though, the truth is that there are lots of people who don't know things, who feel as if they should have already have known them, but are afraid of sounding ignorant or appearing foolish in some way. But specifically for our privileged identities, pushing through the fear and getting over our egos, getting out of our own way is necessary. It's less important that we appear aware and more important that we increase our commitment to becoming aware. So I'm going to say that again. It's less important that we appear aware and more important that we commit to increasing our awareness. What we have to gain is worth the risk. And while we wait, while we worry about how we might appear, we're on the sidelines in the neutral zone. We're complicit. Desmond Tutu has a quote that says, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. Once we recognize that we will fall, that we will make mistakes, that we don't have it all figured out, we can stop posturing and open ourselves up to unlearning misinformation and making room for helpful information. But there are some ways that we get in our own way of that. There are some things that we do to get in our own way. So two of those ways, in terms of meeting this goal of increasing our own awareness, of self-reflecting for the purpose of social change, two challenges that lie before us are egocentrism and ethnocentrism. But before I continue in that, I just want to acknowledge power dynamics, because that's important. So to be clear here, I'm not talking about the level of awareness that people with oppressed identities have to have and the assumptions that they need to make about those who are in relation, the assumption that they need to make about those who are privileged in relations to themselves for their own survival. For example, people of color making judgments and decisions on how to navigate the structurally racist criminal justice system, or folks in the LGBT community about how to navigate the world that is heterosexist and transphobic and a lot of other things. So I'm not talking about the assumptions that folks make from their marginalized identities. I'm talking about the assumptions that we make from our places of privilege that ultimately serve to reinforce the message of our superiority and make us complicit with the oppression of others. So egocentrism. It refers to the ways in which we put ourselves at the center of the universe. In developmental psychology, it often refers to a stage in development where young children can have difficulty understanding that there are realities that are different from the ones that they're currently experiencing, believing that other people experience the world in the same ways that they do. While this term is often discussed in terms of stages of cognitive development, as if children can graduate from this way of thinking, there are many ways that adults also struggle with the reality that not everyone in the world experiences life in the exact same ways that we do, believes the same things that we do, values what we value, dislikes what we dislike. And we make all kinds of assumptions that aren't necessarily true because of that, because of being very egocentric. So here are some just some quick example narratives that are out there. We all know my religion, and you can insert whatever religion that might be, needs to be the foundation of our society. It's impossible to have a moral compass without it. Nothing else could prevent us from destroying each other. Another example could be, of course, a heterosexual two-parent household is the only model for raising a family. Everybody knows that. This isn't me saying this. These are just examples. When my great-grandparents came to this country, all they had was $1 and a dream. But they became independently wealthy. They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They didn't complain like people do today. They weren't looking for a handout. This is America, the land of equal opportunity. If you believe in yourself and you work hard, you can succeed. That's what separates the rich from the poor. So think about what examples you might have experienced or maybe even believed yourself at different points in your life. Each of these narratives carries with it a certain assumption. And the driving assumption is that everybody knows that. Of course, this is the way it is. Now, ethnocentrism is very closely aligned with egocentrism. So closely aligned with believing that all others experience the world in the same ways as we do is the belief that all others should believe that our way is the best way. So ethnocentrism can refer to ways in which we think our culture and ways of doing things are superior to other ways of doing things. So you combine egocentrism, not recognizing that others, or thinking that others experience the world the way you do, with ethnocentrism. Not only do other folks experience the world the way that I do, but everyone should experience the world that I do. So you combine those dynamics with some power behind it, and then that's how we can get into situations where there's legislation proposed that involves the execution of people who are in the LGBTQ community, Q plus community, denying them services, environments that exclude people with disabilities, structurally racist practices in housing, employment, law enforcement, criminal justice, education, and more. I was just looking at this. There was this video I saw on Facebook about some community where it was a wealthy predominantly white suburban community where some of the residents of that community before moving in, they had to sign this contractor or what have you. And they were just finding out that there was a clause in there that said that only white folks could live in that community. So if a person of color was in that community and living there, they had to be a servant of one of the white folks. And this is in our 17, 16 years of things happening. And they were surprised that was in there. I was also at another event, maybe 5 or 6 years ago at that was put on by the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion that focused on housing segregation in Detroit, the impacts of that. And one of the facilitators there shared that they had bought some property years ago in the city, and the deed had still said for white Christians only. So when you combine everyone experiences the world in the ways that I do, and then everyone should, and you combine that with some power to make that so, not in reality, but at least have enough social influence to make that happen, that's when you get a lot of these inequalities that we have today. And it's also important to say that people who are on the receiving end of those inequalities are often blamed for the physical, the emotional, the social violence that's asserted against them. So all of us are implicated somehow in this. And so it's important to think closely about how we can get out of our own way and think about how we can contribute to social change. And so there's this quote that I use sometimes with social work students that goes, a social worker needs to feel with conviction that their culture, way of life, values, etc., are only one way of doing things, that there are other equally valid ways, not better or worse, but different. And thinking about our power and privilege is an important part of that. Sometimes we can get into these spaces where it's like, I have it worse than you, or you shared a story. Oh, well, you don't know the half. Let me tell you what happened to me. And something that is sometimes called Oppression Olympics, where folks are talking about how it turns into a conversation about, how oppressed are we and how can I, sort of one up that. But there is no hierarchy of oppression. It's hard to fully address one area of oppression without having questions about another, because in many ways, things like racism or white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosexism reinforce and intersect with and reinforce with one another. So there really isn't a hierarchy there, but it's important that we think about the power that we hold and how we use that. So there's an activity that I use sometimes as an icebreaker, lid opener with students, or if I'm doing a workshop that talks about power and privilege, that involves giving small groups of participants a blank sheet of paper. The paper, I'm told, this blank sheet of paper, give it to members of the group, or sometimes I'll put it on the floor or put it somewhere in the middle and see how folks interact with it. But let them know that the paper represents power, and it's up to them to decide what to do with it. So there's really no wrong way to go about it. It's the process that the folks go through to reach their conclusion that's really the important thing. But sometimes a variety of different things can happen. So some folks may rip the paper up and distribute it equally. Others may decide against it for some reason or another. Sometimes, depending on how people are showing up in the room and who they are, the environment can get really competitive. One instance, though, that causes me to stop and think every time I see it is when the paper or the power is rejected. Whether someone refuses to touch it or drops it to the ground, whenever it happens, it causes me to think about attempts to consciously reject power. Listening to the voices and experiences of folks whose marginalization is, in a lot of ways, literally the foundation of your privilege, can be an example of an attempt to consciously reject the flow of power. But what about when the rejection of power shows up as the denial of power? We want to view ourselves positively. We all want to, be seen and believe that we're good people. We want others to view us positively as well. Denying power and privilege that we hold can be a way of protecting ourselves from internalizing the reality and the gravity of our active and passive participation in oppressive systems, which allows us to maintain a cherished, although false, sense of who we really are and what we're really doing. Some examples of how it can start. I don't have a discriminating bone in my body. I treat everyone the same. I don't have a discriminating bone in my body. Slavery happened a long time ago. I, as a white person today, have nothing to do with that. I worked hard to get where I am. I'm not that guy from the alley. Not all men. Those Christians do not represent me. I know you've had some experiences, some bad experiences, but so think about how we're able to recognize some of the most extreme forms of bigotry and oppression, but less able, and at times even less willing, to notice and acknowledge it in its more subtle forms. I'm nothing like those people. Sometimes either hearing those things or saying those things. Now, while it may help us feel better about ourselves in the moment, the act of attempting to drop the paper or drop the power doesn't change the reality of our group memberships and the privileged positions they provide us. And it can even make things worse. particularly if we say we'd like to work with others toward a more socially just community and are actively engaged in helping relationships. Denial can also transition into a distraction in that in acting it out actually reinforces our privilege by putting the blame on targeted folks for their legitimate mistrust or confrontation. Some limited examples are, I'm feeling attacked and I'm not going to feel guilty for being white. Reverse racism is the real problem here. I'm offended. I was on your side, but your anger changed that. So think of that. Think of that message. So you're showing up in support of a group that is marginalized. And because you received some feedback that what you said or what you did was hurtful, or at the very least it wasn't helpful, you're going to say, oh, you should just be grateful I showed up. But now that you're telling me I'm not going to. So then you have to ask the question, then, were you really in solidarity with these folks in the first place? Was it really about helping them, or was it about making yourself feel better? I haven't had it easy either. I feel like my Christian faith is under attack. Oh, it's just a joke. Men can't say anything these days. So instead of actively focusing on how we participate in oppression, responding defensively can be an attempt at manipulating marginalized people into making us feel better about ourselves and taking care of our feelings before we're first able to listen. Ultimately, it's a derailing any critical dialogue that would have taken place. So that's a quite effective silencing tactic. Oppression is not designed to work in reverse. Just in case there were any questions about that. Oppression is not designed to work in reverse. There is no reverse racism. There is no heterophobia. There is no reverse sexism, etc., right? Feeling attacked or hurt in the moment from our place of privilege, whatever that might be, fails to compare to the everyday lived experiences of the people who are on the receiving end of the oppression that we benefit from. So when working in service or solidarity or ally or as an ally or what the whatever your effort might be, it's important to it's important to consider the question, to continue to consider that question of in this work, whose feeling really matters in those moments? Whose feelings really matter in those moments? Is it about me making myself feel good and, talking to my neighbors and groups about, oh, what I just did for this poor person or that person? Or is it about me really thinking critically about, is what I'm doing theater? Is it just for show? Or is it genuine? And if it is genuine, that means opening ourselves up to receiving that feedback and adapting and changing from it. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about social justice elitism, which is the other side of which is another side, not the other side. There are multiple, but which is another side of something that can happen where we get into our own way. So some time ago, I was on this interview panel, and I was asked how I would approach students whose approach in working with others may participate in a dynamic that has been called social justice elitism. So is it basically, there's a lot of ways to think about it, but one of the ways I think about it is this idea that, I know more than you, and I'm going to make sure you know that every second of our interaction together. I'm going to make sure you know just how ignorant you are in a way that is about uplifting the person who's actually doing it and not really about creating change. So not only have I witnessed social justice elitism in others, at times I'm constantly engaged in resisting this tendency in myself as well. Okay, so one way I respond to it is to model vulnerability by sharing my own mistakes. I found that I've been able to foster some really restorative spaces in classrooms and community groups, but I've also had harmful experiences in those spaces, and I've also at times done harm in some of those spaces. So I talk with students about times when I experience my own anger, times when the weight of my own oppression becomes too heavy to bear, the frustrations that come with the invalidation that I receive, when I come into contact with people who don't get it, particularly because they don't have to. I let them know that the anger they experience is okay. It's okay to be angry. because too often people with marginalized identities are asked to be objective or to respond to oppressive conditions calmly or rationally, without consideration of how power plays into who gets to define what is rational, who gets to define what's objective. So I recognize the pressure to monitor the tone of someone responding to their own marginalization is a silencing tactic and a derailing tactic at an attempt to focus on the feelings of persons with privilege instead of what they've actually done. So it's important to actually acknowledge those feelings, but then it's also something that I've realized is that the same, level of anger that I experience at folks who might not understand something in a way that it impacts some of my marginalized identities, someone else could be looking at me with that same rage because I don't recognize or get something in some way that I'm privileged in which they are not. And so it's important to hold both of those things simultaneously. So keeping those in mind, the hope is that we approach learning with humility, recognizing that we have things to give, but also that we have things to learn. So at that moment, I'm going to end there, and we'll have time to talk, I believe, in the talk back. So thank you.